coming with
Hi,
you.
everybody on the internet. Art will be here shortly. I do want to say, Carol, it wasn't that complicated, but it sure took a lot of explaining. So it's nice to be here for this after lunch Tenemos. So I wonder what that means. What burning question was on Shriya's mind when he was thinking who would be part of this session. So it's my pleasure to be doing this session with Art Kleiner, a colleague and friend from a number of efforts, and we'll share with you the latest project that we've been working on that integrates strategy and organizational learning. And we've got some terrific other people that are following us that we will introduce in our session. But in the spirit of weaving, I wanted to talk about a good burning question. And a burning question that I have is, what's different this time from last? What's different this time from last? I think it's an important question for us to always ask, because that's part of what leads us into the learning. But I'm going to answer it, first of all, from the perspective of the Systems Thinking in Action conference. What's different this time from last is, well, this is a new beginning. The last time I believe I was at a Systems Thinking in Action conference was in Boston. And before that, I'd been to a couple in San Francisco, and many when they were just hosted at MIT when they got started. So we have different people, a broader audience, a new process, and for me right now, at least, a curious approach. And where's Cliff? There he is. In the spirit of polarity thinking, I can't do that without also asking what's similar. And what's similar is, well, certainly seeing old friends and making new ones. I'm always surprised by this conference because it's always different than what I expected. There are new ideas that always come up, new approaches. There's energy, there's engagement, and it's always a time to pause and think. So that's what's different this time from last. I also thought I would share with you answering that question about this place. I have been to this place once before, and it was for a different conference. That conference was a conference sponsored by the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the Department of Defense on Lean Six Sigma across all of the armed forces. So we had Army people here, Navy people, Air Force. So this time what's different is the camouflage people are out there and we're in here. They did not use, at least explicitly, organizational learning or systems thinking. They used a process which, by the way, Cliff also had a lot to do with measurement and helped guide them. And what's similar is there were conference presentations, and a lot of what they were trying to do was get a handle around what works and what doesn't work in comparing the various projects they'd done in different forces, sharing their knowledge and their wisdom. And I think what's similar that we have, and that's going to lead me to my co-presenter who will talk about our topic, is learning from the few successful examples. So many opportunities for managing change and systems change in organization have their pockets of success, but then they don't really go anywhere. And that's very much, I think, what was the case with a lot of the Lean Six Sigma projects. Success in some areas, but not broad or not sustained transformation. And broad and sustained transformation is what our topic is about. So I'll turn it over to Art, and I'll be back.
And I'll be here. Well, I didn't actually realize that our topic was about organizational learning until we got into it. This is a work in progress, and this is, to my knowledge, the first public talk about it. It's a project being done in part by a business corporation, a management consulting firm called Booz & Company. But it's also, we've been working closely with George, and we've been working with academia. We've been pulling together a lot of different things, and our subject has been how companies build distinctive capabilities, but it's really about collective mastery. It's about how any group of people can come to the place where they can do things together, not only that's more than they could do apart, but how they can reach a kind of meeting of the minds, a blending of proficiency in the tools they use, the way they work, the way they think together, the way they operate, that becomes remarkable and has a remarkably powerful impact. And one of the places where this has happened is with certain large companies. And in this research project, we set out to study some of those large companies. And we chose them by reputation. I'm not going to apologize for the fact that we're studying large companies as opposed to large types of other organizations, because we are a management consulting firm, and that's where we had the opportunity to look. And one of the open questions is how applicable this is to other types of organizations and other types of groups of people. And we haven't begun to think about that yet. But we do think that these companies and other companies like them are very interesting. These are companies that have a reputation for doing something their own way. Consistently over time, they're known for being successful because of what they do, as opposed to successful because they have a particular product or because they're in a particular place or in a particular country, or they've all evolved a way of operating and a way of working that is renowned for that reason. And we chose these companies by asking around in our firm and elsewhere. What are the companies that really have a reputation for being successful because of what you did? And we also looked we had other criteria. We wanted companies that were financially successful. We wanted companies that were diverse around the world and diverse in different industries. And we wanted companies where we legitimately felt we could learn something about them. So the top 5, Danaher, IKEA, Natura, which is a remarkable Brazilian personal care and cosmetics company, Heineken, and Cemex, a Mexican cement company. We spent a fair amount of time interviewing people in those 5 companies and learning how they built the capabilities that set them apart. And then we looked at the other companies through work published about them or work that was being written about them, including George's work on United Technologies, UTC, which is there. These are all really different companies, different types of organizations. And they're all kind of treated as oddball operations. The classic example being Apple, where anyone in business has had it up to here with the question of why can't you be as successful as Apple? And of course, because we're not Steve Jobs, and he's gone now, so not even Apple can be as successful as Apple. And that is the sort of the established conventional wisdom about a really creative, insightful, and mercurial leader who can take a company to remarkable places. Except that it turns out that all these other companies did many of the same things that Steve Jobs did at Apple. It looked different. It came across as different. It was in a different industry. But when you kind of looked at the underpinnings of them, it was basically very similar. The systemic dynamics, the systems with which they worked, didn't look very much like each other, but the underlying interrelationships were the same. And as you guys know, that's very common in systems thinking, is to discover similarities among things that look different and discover that they do have a kind of family resemblance and operational sympathy that one can then draw conclusions from. So we've been going ahead and drawing some conclusions, and George and I are part of a group of about somewhere between 6 and 10 people, depending on how you count them. who have been studying these companies and trying to discover what they have in common. And I'm going to show you one thing they have in common. First of all, that's our definition. Capable company is one that distinguishes itself and gains advantage through what it does exceptionally well. They build capabilities, and they rely on those capabilities. A capability is a combination of processes, tools, knowledge, skills, and organization. Allows a company to consistently produce results. Building a capability, becoming proficient, is not the same as doing good economic performance, in the same way that building a human capability and becoming a high caliber person is not the same as passing a standardized test. We're about creating a group of people, perhaps a large group of people, that actually can do great things in the world, and how do they do it? And these are companies that have consistently gotten the reputation, at least, for doing exactly that. You may not agree with everything they do. For example, you might not agree that McDonald's does great things. But if you're, a parent in a suburban or city environment looking for an inexpensive and safe place for your kids to play that is reliable and consistent, you may find that McDonald's proficiency is one that you appreciate from time to time. Okay, we think we found this cycle, and I'm going to talk about this cycle in the next 5 or 6 minutes. That's what I have. And then I'm going to, and then George is going to describe how it plays out and how other factors play out in one large company. So every one of these companies has a leader or leaders with a reality distortion field, which is what they used to call Steve Jobs' attitude at Apple, where people would say that's impossible, and we would say, well, I've already said we're going to do it. And every one of these companies has a story where somebody says, in IKEA's case, we're going to create a better life for the many people. In Apple's case, we're going to create insanely great computers. Every one of them has something similar. We will do something no one else can do. And then there is always some lucky group of people who have to figure out how to make that happen. And if it's early in the stage, and by the way, when I say all this, I'm describing what we saw. So I'm a reporter now. This is not like a management expert saying, here's what you should do. This is what we saw and what we concluded from what we saw. There is some group of people who come together in a creative way, and they create what we called recipes, which, by the way, is a word we borrowed from Robert Putnam, the organizational learning guy who worked with Chris Argyris. But basically, codified combinations of process, technology, know-how, creativity, uniquely adapted to this enterprise. You could also call it a routine. You could call it an algorithm. You could call it making tacit knowledge explicit. They figure it out, they write it down. And they do it in a way where somebody else can do that. Somebody else can do that thing. They operationalize the aspiration. And they make it very tangible and concrete. You might say that they dance up to the edge of reductionism without falling into the abyss. Having worked at the Whole Earth Catalog, I followed Our Bodies, Ourselves for quite some time. And on some level, that's probably not that different from what you were doing. Taking knowledge that had been inchoate and emergent and kind of making it tangible. And undoubtedly, there were shortcuts and oversimplifications along the way that had to work themselves out. And that's what's happening here. You get a series of recipes, and they prototype them. They sort of pull them together. They work them a bit. And then the company has to figure out how to bring it to scale. So now here's where you see the difference between a disciplined company and a conventional company. The conventional company is watching everybody else and benchmarking, and if our competitors are doing it, we have to do it too. The disciplined company, the IKEA or the Danaher, cares about what they think is the right thing to do. You may disagree that it's the right thing, but they think it's the right thing to do, and they stick with it. And they, it's not quite that they repeat it 10,000 times until they're experts at it, but they establish the routines, and they force people to do the routines, and they look askance at variation from the routines. But they also make sure that the people who are doing all of this disciplined repetition are paying attention to what they're doing, mindful of what they're doing, and if something doesn't go right, they're talking about it. They're identifying it. So they're disciplined, routinized, right on the edge of reductionism, but also with their minds, they're looking at it and saying, this doesn't work, and going back to the designers, and there's a great deal of back and forth. And all of the companies that we looked at have this quality. And this is a really discomforting way to live if you're a conventional manager, growing up in a business school or an engineering school, because this requires, sort of not having the answer, but continually, but even though you don't have the answer, you keep having to do the same thing again and again and again until you get the answer. So this is, something that outside of some practices like Lean, very, very few people have experience with. And these companies have either learned to do it or lucked into it, but they all do that. And then the third thing we saw is that sooner or later, these people practicing recipes over and over again. And by the way, they're not like within a function or a single discipline. They're cross-disciplinary. The marketing people and the R&D people and the learning and development people are all working together on something. They're not within their silos, as they're called. But sooner or later, they become master chefs in a master kitchen. They no longer need recipes because they know how to do something that nobody else does. So, at some of these companies, they start to seem like they're doing uncanny things. And people look at them and say, how does that company do that? How does IKEA manage to become the biggest furniture company in the world when they're just like selling slabs of processed wood inside boxes, and they're making everybody put the furniture together themselves, and you can never get what you want, and the wrenches don't, make any sense. And how did they do that? This is how they did it. They continued to build and refine the processes, and that leads to reworking the recipes, which leads to more and more capabilities, which leads to more and more tacit knowledge, which leads to more and more sophistication, which leads to better chefs in better kitchens, doing better things. And it would go on forever, and the companies would take over the world, except for the, as you guys know, there's limits to all growth. And in this case, so you can think of that inner loop as a big reinforcing loop. Really, the companies that get on that bandwagon do incredible things. I know some people in this room have been in some of those companies. But sooner or later, they start to believe the hype about themselves. It starts out very innocent. In fact, that upper loop is what Bruce Henderson of Boston Consulting Group called the experience curve. Things, you're more and more proficient, so it's cheaper and cheaper. You get more and more market share. More and more people want your products. And eventually, it seems like you can do no wrong. And of course, that's the moment at which, if you're a leader of a company, you have to be extremely careful, because you are now vulnerable to your own complacency, your own arrogance, and your collective arrogance, which is worse than individual arrogance, because everybody is being arrogant on each other's behalf and not letting anybody else hear the warnings about arrogance, which they would listen to themselves if they were on their own, but they're together and they're responsible for each other, so they are shielding each other from any sanity. And remarkably enough, these capable companies, in the stories we learned from them, in the histories we did, they all have moments, or most of them, some of them are coming to these moments, where they said, we're going to be in trouble unless we watch our ways, unless we change our ways. And they shift something. And every one of these companies has a story of that sort. I think that's kind of the theory, right? That's what we've seen, and it's generalized, and we think it's pretty true. And George is going to describe what really happened.
Actually, George is going to be very wise and notice that we're already over our time.
Oh my gosh.
So what I am going to do is tell you that in our open space meeting, which we'll advertise and talk about tomorrow, I'm going to talk about the example of United Technologies and its development of its Achieving Competitive Excellence business operating system, and how that gives us an example of the identity of the company, the recipes they developed, the repetition they did over the years. By the way, repetition involves failure and recovery, and then the collective mastery that led to, for them, having been the highest performing company, Fortune 50 company in the past decade. The question that we want to ask in our open space is UTC really a capable company? Again, we didn't study them as a capable company. We brought them in as an additional one. But we frame that around, is your organization capable? And what does this theory suggest you would need to do? And we, by the way, even though we're writing a book, we haven't written a book. So we're looking for that feedback. We're looking for your insights. We're here because we see this integrally connected to organizational learning processes. And therefore, we thought this would be a community to come to and test out our theory. So this is really the workshop that we want to do together tomorrow. And really look at what is the role of organizational learning in developing, creating capabilities and capable companies and enduring success. And that's what we shall offer you on Friday.